Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. My name is Darren Fluke. I'm the Comprehensive Planning Manager for the City of Boise, and here to talk to you today about the Transportation Action Plan that we prepared for the city. I tend to talk kind of loud, so if I get too close to the microphone and it's loud, let me know. Just do this, because I will yell at you. So we have an interesting situation in the city of Boise, in fact, in Ada County in general. And does anybody know what I'm going to refer to here? Chris does. We have the Ada County Highway District, which is something that is unique. We've found no other jurisdiction that organizes their roadways the way that we do here. And so that presents some opportunities, and it also presents a lot of challenges. And so we embarked on the Transportation Action Plan basically to articulate for the Ada County Highway District the way that we wanted the transportation system to function for the city of Boise. And our contention was that business as usual, if it had worked for us up to this point, was not going to work for us going forward as a city. And you'll see why. I'm going to go through a lot of this. And then if I have enough room at the end, I'm going to go through a couple of case studies for you, or show how we think the TAP can apply to actual on-the-ground projects. I should say at the outset as well that we called this a plan, the Transportation Action Plan, but I would characterize it as about 3/4 policy document and 1/4 plan. So it really is more of a policy plan. It won't, I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's just go forward with what the TAP is. And the TAP is Boise's vision of a modern, well-balanced transportation system. I kind of spoke to that. It includes a set of principles and values that vision is based upon. It also includes a set of targeted actions, which we call the mobility moves. And you can think of those as categories of projects, or a way to organize various transportation projects. It then also has an evaluation matrix at the end. And this was something we were really interested in making work. And what it's supposed to be is sort of an objective way of evaluating dissimilar projects against one another. So as a city, we sometimes have a hard time prioritizing a sidewalk project next to a road widening project. The way ACHD does road widening projects is pretty simple. They look at safety and delay, and based on those two metrics and then some machinations on return on investment, they come up with a ranked set of projects. We wanted to do that across the spectrum for all modes, and it proved very difficult. I think we've had limited success, and if any of my colleagues were in here, they could tell you how it's working, but they're not, probably because they don't want to talk about that, so it was difficult. And then finally, we think of the document as a communication tool. We're really using this to get out and talk to the citizenry and help them think about transportation in a different way than we have in the past. In the West, we're very auto-centric, and the West has primarily been built up since the advent of the automobile. And it's for those of us who haven't spent a lot of time in other cities, it's difficult to envision a system that isn't centered around the automobile. And so we're using the plan in that way. The TAP is not a couple of things as well, and first and foremost, it's not a master plan. If you work in transportation planning, you might be surprised to get into the plan and note that there's not a list of projects that are fiscally constrained or not fiscally constrained. It's really more of project ideas than it is a list of projects that need to happen. There's no evaluation of the transportation system for crash rates, delay, or other things that we look at in transportation planning. And that's why it's also not a capital improvement plan, because there's not a list of projects in there. It's not a public involvement exercise, or it wasn't anyway when we went through it. And I know I just said that it's a communication tool, and it is. But when we went through the plan, we were basing it on a lot of work that had happened between our agencies for a long time. So we have the city's comprehensive plan, which is a deep dive into land use and transportation for the city. We adopted that in 2011, and so it's, as comprehensive plans go, it's quite fresh, and we're happy with the performance of the plan so far. So there was that. There's Valley Connect, which is our regional transit agency's transit plan for the area. There's a lot of good work that ACHD has done on livable streets and integrating land use and transportation. And then there's the work that our regional planning agency, Compass, has done to better integrate land use and transportation at the regional level and help prioritize how we spend federal dollars in the area. And so our take was we didn't need to go out. All of those documents have a whole bunch of public involvement behind them. We felt like we had a good sense of where the public was at. And so starting from that point, we went ahead and created more of a technical vision document and didn't do a lot of public involvement. And that was by design. And then finally, the plan is not a challenge to ACHD. Any of you who live around this area are, I'm sure, familiar with some of the challenges that the city and ACHD face just in getting along. And really, this was something that we did based on questions that they had for us. You know, understandably, they become frustrated when they don't understand where the city's coming from and what we want. And so we took this on as a sincere effort to really articulate in a comprehensive and really numbers-based empirical way what we want and why we want it and why we think it makes sense. So that's a little of the background on why we did it, but going a little deeper into the whys is the growth and shifting demographics, and I'm going to get into each one of these a little bit deeper here in a second. The costs of business as usual, that is, we looked at what would the transportation system look like through time if we just keep doing what we've been doing all this time. Economic development considerations or lost opportunities in the economic development realm, and transportation choice. There was a lot of ways for us to characterize this. All of you who work in planning know that there are a lot of good reasons to get more people out of automobiles and using other modes. We could have come at it from an environmental perspective because it is better for the environment if we have fewer cars on the road. We could have come at it from a public health perspective because we're all happier the less time we spend in cars. I think that's been quantified in recent years, but moreover, just using more active transportation is just healthier, right? But these things don't tend to resonate very well in Idaho or in the West in general because we're wholly populated with rugged individualists who don't like government telling them what to do. And so we came at it more from the idea of freedom of choice, which is you need, right now we've built a system where you don't have choice in mode depending on where you live. And so our contention is that if we, as government, provide more choices for people in mode, we will get a more well-balanced transportation system. And in fact, we did document that in other cities that we looked at. So we started out with a deep dive on what other places are doing with regard to transportation. And we called this the Mobility White Papers. And so, this is the foundational document for the TAP. This is where the chewy data lives. And so if you're interested in getting into what we based these higher level ideas on, they can be found here. I won't read all of those to you, but there were 7 of them. And there's some really good data and information and graphics in there if any of you want to borrow that. So with regard to, let me just do this real quick. So we're going to do growth and shifting demographics first. And with regard to growth, this was a population density map that's produced by Compass, the regional planning agency for our area, in 2010. This is the projection for 2040. And my favorite part of this presentation is just to toggle back and forth. So you can see where the density is starting to concentrate in the city of Boise. So just more people, that's one thing. And I'm sure you're seeing all of that in the news now that, Boise, fastest growing city and the fastest growing state in the nation, and it's getting everybody spun up. So that was one good reason for us to do this. In terms of growth, you look at downtown and it becomes really stark. At the present time, we've got actually more than 33,000. The last number I had was closer to 40,000 people working downtown every day. Only 4,000 people living down here, though. So this has a couple of implications. You see what's going to happen in 20 years with those numbers rising. A couple of things that I want to talk about here is one is that jobs housing balance. What we would like to achieve for all the cities in the county is sort of a 1-to-1 ratio, you know, where you've got a job or two jobs, not two jobs, but a job per household. But right now in Boise, we're at about 1.83 jobs per households, which is the highest in the valley by far. Most of the other cities are something less than 1. And so what we're striving to do for our own selves, what we have control over, is to try to get more housing downtown and more affordable housing downtown. Second part is really hard, so I'm not going to get into the affordability part of it. But we are meeting with some success. We're about in the middle of a 5-year initiative to get 1,000 new dwelling units downtown, and it looks like we're going to meet that target, and we're really happy with how housing is coming together. But the other thing is a parking implication. So if I've got 40,000 people working downtown every day, think about how I park those people. We've only got 18,000 parking places in all of downtown between public and private. So we already know that the mode shift the mode split for downtown is different than it is for the rest of the city. I'm going to talk more about that in a subsequent slide. But if I can get just 10% of those folks that are coming downtown to work using an alternative mode, that's 4,000 cars that you can keep out of the downtown core, which is already congested at times. But we're also seeing a big shift in the preferences of the generational cohorts. And so what this graph is showing you is that millennials, which are the largest generational cohort now, having exceeded the baby boomers, and that's what this chart is showing you, is that they are the largest generational cohort. And what we're finding is that their preferences, as well as the preferences of the baby boomers, so remember the two largest cohorts, are starting to converge. They both prefer, from all the literature that we found anyway, I mean, I'm not trying to overgeneralize this, but in general, both of these generational cohorts would prefer to live in walkable places where they don't have to get into a car to access their every daily need. And so they want a range of services, and this necessarily means, you know, denser, closer in living. I'm going to take a pause here and see if I can look at this so I don't have to keep turning. And this is something, you know, that we heard a lot of. We did a series of roundtables through a process called Boise Competes, where we wanted to understand how we rank up against our peer cities and what helps people choose to come to Boise or not choose to come to Boise. The lens of that really was from an economic development perspective. Why are companies moving here or not moving here? But, you know, in the final analysis, that really comes down to whether or not they can recruit people that want to work for their company and want to live in a place. An important shift that we're seeing in the millennial generation is that they're first choosing where they want to live, and then they'll look for work. And that's a stark change from what it used to be, where my generation, or certainly those from before my generation, would go wherever the job was. And that's how it was when I was getting out of school. But the data is bearing this out as well. This is a complicated graph. I don't expect that you can read it from where you're at. But what it's showing is that every generational cohort after that, about age 50, so from 0 to 50, they're getting driver's licenses at much reduced rates from the previous generational cohort. So this is comparing 1983 driver's license data with 2016, I believe. And it's just, you know, it's showing the trend that the millennials are getting fewer driver's licenses, so they don't want to drive as much. That's borne out by other data as well. We're just seeing a rise in bicycle travel, pedestrian travel, and even transit, and seeing a reduction in automobile travel. And that's stark. This was a big deal in transportation planning. And what this shows you is reductions in both vehicle miles traveled per capita and overall. And so the overall is the blue line, of course, total VMT. The red line is the per capita VMT. And what happened here is when the Great Recession hit, people drove a lot less. That wasn't hugely surprising. But what was surprising is it didn't rebound. I mean, you look at that line and it does this, and that's That's typically how transportation planning is done, is you pick a growth factor based on population, and you just assume that you're going to get X number of more automobile trips, and therefore you need larger roads. But in 2006, that all shifted. Now, I would say that those lines are coming back a little bit more now that the economy's been strong. This is tied to the price of gas in many ways. But coupled with other, the other demographics that we're seeing, we still think this is a very significant trend. And then there's this idea of induced demand. And so this is the idea of, that you build a wider roadway and people will come and use it. At first, it's counterintuitive because, we all think that if a roadway is congested, that what you ought to do is just increase the size of the roadway so it can handle more cars. But what we found that what happens is that you make the roadway larger. It therefore is easier to drive. People recognize that and they come back to the road and use it. So the take home from this is that roadways fill up to their ultimate capacity and you'll always be chasing your tail. You can't build your way out of automobile congestion. And we literally looked far and wide through the white paper exercise for a city that was able to find that stasis where they could build a roadway system big enough to accommodate all of the automobile trips that would want to use it, and we couldn't find one. And so that starts to change our thinking about, well, maybe we have to start to think that congestion is a way of life at certain times a day, and what are other techniques for dealing with that don't involve expansion of the roadway. And in case you needed more data, this goes way back to 1998, and I know there's a lot of words here. I try to avoid slides that look like this, but it was just so striking to us that metro areas that invested $22 billion more than other metro areas actually had slightly worse congestion. And so it was proving up on the induced demand concept. And, it just really puts a stark point to different approaches to how you deal with transportation. In case you needed more evidence that the business as usual is going to be a very expensive way to go, this is from the Ada County Highway District's 2035 level of service map. And what they're showing here are roadways that are expected to exceed their acceptable levels of congestion at the peak hour. Now, we could certainly argue or agree to disagree whether using level of service is the right metric, and I think I would argue that it's not based on what we found through this process. But this shows you that there's a whole lot of roadways out there just in our area that are going to be demanding a lot of money. And of course, we don't have enough money to do everything that we need to do now, just to take care of the system that we already have built, let alone go expand all of the roadways there that you see in red. And then with, on this idea of the high cost of business as usual, there's economic development considerations. And I mentioned to you that what we're seeing is we're less competitive with other areas because of the transportation system that we have. And this comes up again and again through the Boise Competes, is that we need a public transportation system that is more robust. I mean, like, newsflash, right? Nobody here understands that. But we wanted to make sure and document it in this process, because if we're off spending money to constantly widen 3-lane roads to 5-lane roads, that's money that can't be invested in public transportation. And so it's never an all or nothing thing, but what we're trying to do is shift the needle, put a shift in priorities that works toward this more well-balanced system. So this is an interesting graph. Basically, what I'm showing you there with the red bracket is the gray areas. And what this is a mode split comparison between us and some of our peer cities. And where we'd like to be is down there on the right-hand side of the chart, where you see Boulder and Seattle, where they're achieving a mode split of somewhere in the 60-40 or even approaching 50-50. I should say the top part of that graph is drive to work alone. And so this is, when I talk mode split in this instance, I'm talking about work commutes. And so in Boise, what you're seeing is about an 80% mode split, where 80% of our workers are driving to work by themselves, with the other 20% getting around other ways. I told you downtown is different than that. I can't tell you what the exact numbers are, but I know they're significantly different, because we can't park 80% of the 40,000 people that are working down here if they were driving alone. So those folks are are, sharing rides, they're riding bikes, they're walking, they're taking transit, and they're taking commuter ride, that sort of thing. And so on this idea of choice, again, this is from Boise Competes, and we hear it a lot, but particularly from the millennials, which is, yeah, you've got the bare bones of a transportation network for public transportation, but it's not convenient. It doesn't go at the times that I want to go, or it's not frequent enough, or it doesn't get close enough to where I'm at. And so the practical implication of this is that if you're a choice rider, that is someone who has a choice in mode, you're probably not going to choose transit. Because for transit to be effective, it needs to be as available, as affordable, as safe, and as convenient as driving is today. And so when I talk about real choice, that's what I mean, is making the other modes as available, as affordable, as safe, and as convenient as it is to drive. And I should also at this point maybe say that, this is really not a knock on what we have. We have a fabulously efficient transportation system as long as you have a car. If you don't have a car, though, then it provides a fair bit of choice or challenge for you to get around. So we'll get back into that a little bit more. So for all of those reasons, we decided we wanted to articulate a different approach for the city. Understand that this is a pointy-headed planner sort of exercise. I mean, this is kind of our utopian ideal of what a transportation system would look like. But we think it's important to set those sideboards so that we can start to move in the right direction. So after doing the white paper exercise and putting together that foundational data, we organized a plan that articulated a vision that was based on values or principles, and that those were translated into those categories of actions. And then finally, we ended with a chapter on a toolbox of how to get there. And I'm going to talk about each one of these. And so this is the vision. It says, we envision a city where all people enjoy real transportation choices that offer safety, optimize infrastructure, and support vibrant neighborhoods. So, how could you be opposed to that, right? It would be like kicking a puppy. There is nothing bad in this to be opposed to, but what does it really mean? And that's the values. And so that's the highlighted words that you saw in there. So when we say all people, we literally mean all people. If you're too old, too young, too infirm, or too poor to drive a car or own a car, you ought to have the same sort of transportation mobility options that everybody else in the city has. When we say real transportation choice, I just talked to you about what that means. Safety is always a consideration, but safety in terms of automobile engineering doesn't always result in the safest facilities for pedestrians and cyclists. And so finding that balance is a challenging and difficult thing to do. And we could talk about, maybe we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about some of the case studies for Boise here in a minute. We thought this idea of optimizing infrastructure was super important. And that is, we've built this really elaborate system of roads that include drainage and they include landscaping in many cases. And it's a really well-connected network. And we thought that by finding efficiencies within that network, it was the most fiscally responsible thing that we could do. So for instance, in many areas of the city, and this is true for all cities, not just here, but you've got lane widths of 12 feet or sometimes even more, and then you've got shoulder widths on that. Those are really not appropriate for an urban area, and so it provides an opportunity for us to use some of that real estate by squeezing down the automobile lanes just a little bit. It provides additional real estate that you can provide better biking facilities or better walking facilities or even a transit lane if you had the transit to put in there. And so that's what we mean by optimizing the infrastructure, is making the best possible use of what we already have. And then finally, vibrant neighborhoods. We think that transportation dollars ought to work a little bit harder, and they ought to do more than just one thing well. When we spend money at the city on, say, a park or a fire station, we plunk that down in an area, and we expect that public investment to do more than just that one thing. We intend it to create place or community and to be an asset to the community that moves beyond just the one single thing that it does. And so busting transportation out of a silo and saying, how can the transportation system work to create great neighborhoods is something we're really interested in making happen. And we do have some tools later on in the document that speak to that. So one of the innovative things that we thought anyway that we did through this process was break the city into 4 different place types. So this was based on our comprehensive plan, which we have, as most cities do, a land use map within the comp plan that says at what densities and what type of land uses we expect the city to develop with over time. So we started there, and we did a GIS analysis of that and did mapping and iterations and came up with 4 sort of proto places within the city. So downtown is the first. It's sort of its own place, and I'm going to get into each one of these just a little bit more. We've got mixed-use corridors, compact residential, and suburban neighborhood. So with regard to the downtown, I'm sure this is not very readable for you. Horrible slide. Since I can't get too in, let me go back real quick. So the downtown, is a different development typology than the rest of the city, and so therefore it demands different sorts of treatments as far as the transportation system goes. Mixed-use corridors, these are corridors that we think of as serving both a mobility function and also an economic function. They typically have lots of commercial uses on the edges, so therefore lots of driveways, but also they carry lots of vehicle trips, and they're a very particular challenge. Compact residential is our traditional neighborhoods, typically built before the advent of the war, World War II, and those are our, the first ring inner suburbs of the city of Boise. If you're familiar with that, it would be like the Central Bench or Vista neighborhood, the North End, the East End, those kind of neighborhoods. And then suburban neighborhoods are typically those that were built after the war, and they just have a somewhat different layout or road typology. Typically, they don't include a grid, which makes transportation planning somewhat easier if you're planning for vehicles, but a whole lot harder if it's for bikes and peds because they lack a lot of connectivity to get people from A to B. It lengthens out trips. And so what we did is went in and cataloged the treatments that we would see happening for each one of these place types to sort of help us organize the kind of development or help us regulate development as it happens in these various areas. So after articulating those place types, then we moved into the mobility moves. And I told you these are the basically categories of projects. And we'll go through each one of them. But really quickly, the way these moves are organized is around these 5 parts. So in the document itself, it sets up a summary where we describe basically what the move is. We talk about actions that the move are intended to do. These are kind of we think of them in terms of hardware and software. So they're either infrastructure or they're policy or programs that are intended to work on this particular category of projects. We have a focus map that identifies where in the city those are where the needs are most acute in this category. And then importantly, we included metrics about how we were going to gauge if we're being successful in implementing the moves and the intended long-term impacts. So I didn't talk about each one of these in detail after that, but Safety for All is the move that basically says what I was saying just a minute ago, that safety means safety for all and not just automobiles. And so implications of this in transportation planning would be reducing corner radii, say, reducing curb cuts where possible, protecting bike lanes if possible, just that full suite of treatments that makes the transportation system safe for all modes. Walk or Bike to the Store is primarily a land use strategy where we're trying to create infill development and allow for commercial or retail type uses that serve that residential development, such that you don't have to get into your car for your every daily need. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that you won't have to drive to work or commute to work by some other mode, but it does mean that when you get home and you're tired and you're fed up, that maybe you could walk to the store to get a 6-pack rather than driving to the store to get a 6-pack. Park Once is a strategy we intend to apply in 2 places initially. The first is downtown, which makes sense. The second is the mall. And this is a really simple idea that is best described by the title, Park Once. What we want you to do is drive your car to where you need to be and then be able to move around by any other mode to get to where you need to go. So in terms of downtown, this would mean come downtown for your job, park your car, and then have access to all the services that downtown has to offer. City's working on a circulator plan to move people around downtown that's meant to do two things. One is the park once idea, but the other thing is that it ties into the regional system. And here I'm speaking mostly of the State Street Bus Rapid Transit Plan that we've been working on for a long time. And if we'll probably get to that here in just a minute. Active routes to school is the essentially the safe routes to school idea. I'm looking at you, Kristen. And that is that, through time as we've built our cities out really centered around the automobile, the school districts took a cue from that as well, and they started to consolidate schools and they started to move them out of the neighborhoods. And you can understand this from a fiscal perspective. It probably makes sense because you get some economy of scale by concentrating more students in a single facility rather than having more rooftops, more teachers, more administrators throughout the neighborhoods. But the implication of that is that we now spend, in this area, we spend more busing kids to school than we do on public transportation. Think about that for a second. We spend more busing kids to school for a limited time, twice a day, for a limited time of the year than we spend on our entire public transportation system. I mean, it's crazy. It's literally crazy. The low-stress bike network is the idea of, we wanted to focus on bikes particularly, and we're doing better. ACHD is doing a great job of incorporating bike facilities now as they expand roadways or as they rebuild existing roadways. We're getting better facilities, but they're not always very comfortable facilities. Yes, they're a dedicated bike facility, but they're not a facility that serves that 8 to 80 demographic. It's probably not something where you'd feel comfortable with your 7-year-old or your 70-year-old mom on it. And so what our contention here is that the city ought to have a bike network that serves the needs of bike commuters much the way the road network serves the needs of automobile commuters. So I think of this in terms of equality versus equity. So equality is a condition where everybody gets the same thing, but equity is a condition where everybody gets what they need. And so we're not saying that every single roadway has to have a bike lane on it. But what we are saying is that you live out at 5 Mile and Victory, or if you work at Cole and Franklin, that you have a safe, efficient way to get to where you need to be by bicycle. And then finally, the 3 best-in-class transit routes. We're working hard on this one now, and I think I have a couple slides for you on this. But when we started this process, the mayor looked at me and he said, don't go saying we need a better transit system in this plan, because we all know that. And until we can do anything about it, I don't want to get people spun up about it. And so we thought long and hard about this, and it was not something that we could ignore, right? Because there's only the 4 modes to work with when we're thinking about mobility and moving people around. And so we had to deal with transit, but we weren't quite sure how to do it. So what we landed on was the 3 best-in-class routes. And this idea says that we will take our highest performing routes and we will dedicate some extra resources to those routes. And really make them sing to help people understand what good transit looks and feels like. And so we've been working with VRT to first articulate what does make a transit route sing. Spoiler alert, the first thing is more frequent headways. The second thing is longer hours of operation. And then the third thing is just better amenities all around. Nicer vehicles with internet access, real-time bus information, and things like that. Things that you've all seen in bigger cities. And so right now we're hugely focused on State Street because it's the furthest along and it is our highest performing route. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Finally, the plan ended up with a mobility toolbox, and it said, well, that's great, or what we said was, that's great if we just articulate all of these lofty ideas, but how do we get there? Especially how do we get there given the fact that we don't control our own street system? And so we put together a toolbox of things that have worked in other cities. We still can't implement these on our own, but it gives us a resource to go to when we're working with ACHD or ITD to say, hey, here's some things that have worked in other places. We'd like to do it here, and here's how it could work, sort of thing. And then this is the evaluation matrix. I'm sure that looks really readable from back there. But what it's showing you is just a cartoon version of how this is supposed to work. So we take a project, which is the big blue circle there, and that's generated in various different ways. It could be through citizenry, it could be from the city, it could be from ACHD or ITD. We then evaluate that against those principles and values that I told you about earlier. And then we move it through the 6 moves. Does it meet some of those moves? And it's getting a ranking all the way through this process. And then we rank it against some of the other planning work that's been done and a return on investment kind of thing. And this is a giant spreadsheet. And at the end, it spits out a composite score that is intended to allow us to do sort of an apples-to-apples comparison with dissimilar projects. Like I said, it's tough. It's very difficult to make something like this totally objective. And there's definitely, the subjectivity, I guess, is built into the model as you put those values in. But it's another tool in the toolbox as far as going to our transportation partners and articulating why we'd like Project X over Project Y. So are we doing okay on time? How late? We go till noon, is that right? Is everyone awake still? Okay. Maybe at this point, did anyone have any questions? I should have said I always mean for these to be interactive, and if you have a question while I'm going through, feel free to ask me. Karin?
When you talk about driver's licenses decreasing, it's out there about when a public transit system comes into play, if that impacts driver's license. So, for instance, larger cities that obviously have public transit, that would then make sense no matter age, demographic. If it's available, is it?
I think there's correlation data out there. Like, for instance, I've heard the statistic that Manhattan has the lowest rate of driver's license ownership or even car ownership in the entire nation. And of course,
Just the millennial thing, it's availability for transit.
Certainly, and land use is a big component of it. There has to be that dense matrix of land uses as well that makes for that, interesting and useful walk that people do.
And I just had to follow up really quickly. Why was industrial not one of your land uses or types?
Great. I haven't had this question before. That's interesting. Our industrial lands are clustered primarily on the fringes, so they're employment areas that accommodate a lot of truck trips and
Public transit, places like Micron or others.
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't. I've never had that question come up. But Micron comes up all the time as in terms of a TDM strategies of transportation demand management strategies, trying to get employees there and out. Good question. Let me go here.
I really like how you bridge the transportation and land use nexus by identifying the land uses that are appropriate by street type.
Mm-hmm.
And that street type includes certain types of users, including the future of your city. Happen to create a functional classification future transportation map that would implement that type of street network?
We didn't. Within the moves, though, so there's the bike network sort of on its own, and there's the Safety for All network, but we didn't lay a functional class scheme over here that's different from what we have with the highway district. Marty, did you have a question?
Yeah, you touched upon the idea about a few things about DMT, and there's this controversy in the transportation circles. Down in Boise, of course, about additional measures, this methodology versus your ideas that really trace more values, you say. Recognize question and then it's so important.
Yeah, so, level of service is an important concept, and it makes, perfect sense in terms of automobiles, because what we were solving for as we went through building out a transportation system was for automobiles. And so it made a lot of sense to look at delay, because that's what gets us all spun up, right, is having to sit through more than one red light. I confess I don't like sitting in the car any more than anybody else. It's frustrating. And it's also easily quantifiable, relatively easily quantifiable from a transportation department perspective. So you can put those metrics together, and it's fairly easy to work with. Where we're going with this is more like establishing level of service for pedestrian facilities, or level of service for bicycle facilities that are analogous to what we do for vehicles now. And really this just gets back to the idea that we have a skewed system, that our system is really dedicated to a single mode, really in many cases to the detriment of the other modes. And so where we're headed is just trying to find a more equitable position. And it's not to tear cars down, but again, it's to provide more choice for more people. And we think that when those choices are provided, that they will avail themselves of those. Chris?
Thank you. There's just one little tiny follow-up. The thing about when you push the button to cross the street as a ped or on a bicycle, like along State Street, it doesn't seem to make any difference. Like crossing over from American Street over to Department of Transportation on that side, you can wait there forever, whether you push the button or not. So this is something that really frustrating, because it takes more time to ride from where we live at 20th and Dora down at Green to State Street. More time to stand there waiting and waiting.
Yeah.
Anyway, this may be a better one for ACHD. But have you ever?
That's not my fault.
No, it's not your fault, but in your discussions, have you ever come across this issue of why these things are like that?
Well, sure. And it's typically the way those things work on those kinds of corridors is that the system is programmed to just keep moving the cars. And until somebody pushes a button, it doesn't know that a ped wants to cross. But just because you push the button doesn't mean it's going to change right away. It's going to wait for the next cycle. I mean, they're all timed together. And so that's how the system works downtown. And, it works reasonably well. I mean, you have to make some of these priority decisions, right? And you do have to move a lot of vehicles. But our contention is that the balance is so far skewed that we can get there, and that's more of a project-specific treatment that we try to push on those kind of issues. As we work on projects with ACHD or with ITD, it's just often they're difficult because they have system-wide implications, and it's not so easy as taking a single situation and making it work better for our bikes and peds, because it ripples throughout the system.